Every country on Earth is imaginary. That doesn't mean they're fake, it means something much stranger. For almost 300,000 years, humans lived on this planet without a single one. No borders, no passports, no flags, no line on the ground that meant you don't belong here. 95% of human history happened before countries existed. So why did we invent them? Picture a hill, 15,000 years ago, a river below, grasslands to the horizon, no fences, no checkpoints, no sign warning you that you've entered someone else's land. You could walk for a year in any direction and never once ask permission. That wasn't freedom exactly, it was just the world. Home wasn't a place, home was the people around you, and for most of our history, that was enough. Then it stopped being enough. Small hunter-gatherer bands ran on something simple. Everybody knew everybody. If you cheated someone, the whole band heard about it by nightfall. There were no police. There didn't need to be. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar later put a number on it. Humans can comfortably hold about 150 real relationships in their heads. Past that, the social math breaks. Wrong. Sorry. It doesn't just break. It stops existing altogether. Reputation-based trust simply has nowhere left to attach. So what happens when a group quietly crosses that number? Nobody rings a bell. There's no ceremony. But somewhere past person 151, the oldest system of trust in human history silently stops working, and nobody in it even notices at first. That failure, invisible and slow, is where this story actually begins. The first fix wasn't a government. It was something almost nobody would predict. People stopped walking. Around 12,000 years ago, in the Levant, communities began living in the exact same spot, year after year. Stone houses, storage pits, cemeteries. And here's the part that should stop you. Most of these people weren't even farmers yet. They settled first. Farming came later. Imagine that family arriving at the river for what should be one more season. The father sharpens a spear, same as always. But this time, instead of packing up when the season turns, they build a wall. Just one. Then, a year later, another. 5 years pass. Their children are born inside those walls and never learn what it feels like to leave. That is how ownership is born. Not with a declaration, with a child who never knew anything else. Because once a family buries someone in the ground, that ground stops being a resource. It becomes a claim. Archaeologists suspect some of the earliest graves and monuments served exactly that purpose. A silent message to any outsider who wandered close. Our people belong here. Long before a single wall or fence existed, the dead were humanity's first border markers. But belonging to dirt still isn't enough to unite strangers. If thousands of people who've never met are going to cooperate, family loyalty can't do the job. They need something bigger than blood. They need a shared belief, a story everyone in the group agrees to treat as real. In southeastern Turkey, there's a site called Göbekli Tepe, massive carved stone pillars, over 11,000 years old, built by hunter-gatherers who hadn't invented farming yet, or writing, or the wheel. Raising those stones took hundreds of people, from different groups, coordinating on a single project with no king to order them, and no crop surplus to feed them. Here's the part that overturns the textbook. For a century the story was, agriculture came first, and it gave people enough free time and surplus to invent religion. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Belief came first. Religion may not be something civilization built. Civilization may be something religion built. For maybe the first time ever, strangers cooperated not because they shared a grandmother, but because they shared a story. That single shift is the reason 7 billion people now share a planet, instead of 7 billion tiny, isolated tribes. Then came the twist nobody saw coming. Once people learned to grow wheat and barley, they produced more food than they could eat. Surplus. Harmless-sounding word. It wasn't. Because stored food can be counted, and anything that can be counted can be taken. Political scientist James C. Scott argues this is the real origin of the state. Not because grain fed people, but because grain, unlike root vegetables buried underground, ripens above the soil in plain sight, on a predictable schedule. A ruler didn't even need to trust you. He just needed to look at the field. For the first time in human history, someone could stand at the edge of your harvest and know exactly what you owed him. Someone had to record it. Someone had to collect it. Someone had to guard it. Would you have paid that first tax? Nobody asked you. That's the point. By the time anyone thought to ask, the system was already running. Without planning to, humanity had just built the skeleton of government. And once there was something worth stealing, there was something worth defending. Some of the oldest stone walls on Earth rise around early settlements like Jericho. Historians still argue about whether they kept out raiders, floods, or something else entirely. It doesn't actually matter which, because building them required three things no hunter-gatherer band had ever needed: planning, leadership, coordination. Hundreds of people, pulling toward one goal, for a family tie that didn't exist between most of them. That gap, the space where family loyalty ran out, is exactly where administration was born to fill it. Stored grain did something else too, something uglier. In a hunter-gatherer band, trying to hoard or boast got you mocked back into line. Arrogance had nowhere to grow. A granary changed the rules completely. Whoever controlled the grain controlled who ate. Food became power. Power became authority. Authority became hereditary. Chiefs became kings. Villages became kingdoms. And every one of those new kings ran straight into the same wall. How do you rule 10,000 people you will never personally meet? Family loyalty had already failed once, back at 150 people. It was about to fail again, at a scale nobody had a word for yet. The answer would arrive from the strangest possible place. Not the throne, not the temple, a ledger. Everyone assumes writing began with a story. Wrong. It began with a debt. The first thing humans ever wrote down wasn't a poem, a prayer, or a king's name. It was, "Who still owes me grain?" As Mesopotamia's cities exploded, a few hundred people ballooning into tens of thousands in a place like Uruk, memory simply ran out of room. Strangers were now living beside strangers, trading with strangers, depending on systems no single mind could track. So officials pressed marks into wet clay: grain in, grain out, debts owed, labor promised. Civilization's first written words were a spreadsheet. It's a strange fact to sit with. The thing that eventually gave us law, literature, and scripture began as a way to make sure nobody skipped a tax payment. With writing came bureaucracy. With bureaucracy came governments that could finally outthink human memory. And once a government could track exactly who owed what and where they lived, it needed one more thing: a line. At first, the line was almost petty. Neighboring city-states didn't fight over grand ideology. They fought over a canal, a strip of fertile mud. Whose barley field started where? But here's the moment worth pausing on. Rulers stopped settling it with vague understanding and started settling it with surveyors. Some of the oldest inscriptions on Earth are literally boundary disputes. Markers driven into the ground, treaties between kings, punishments spelled out for whoever crossed the wrong furrow. For the first time, land wasn't just occupied. It was measured, documented, claimed. An idea, ownership, had just become a physical object you could trip over. And the moment a line exists, it needs defenders. Would you obey a border if nobody stood there to enforce it? Nobody in Mesopotamia did either. Which is exactly why what happened next was inevitable. Protection demanded armies. Armies demanded leaders. Leaders demanded resources. Resources came from taxes. Follow the chain, because it never breaks. Stored grain paid workers, workers built walls, walls defended harvests, harvests financed soldiers, soldiers defended borders, borders protected grain. It's a loop. And once a loop like that starts spinning, it doesn't need a visionary at the center of it. Nobody sat down 11,000 years ago and sketched out a country. Countries are what happens when a feedback loop runs for 10,000 years without anyone hitting stop. But paperwork and grain loops don't fully explain why some of these societies became terrifyingly powerful. There's a darker engine running underneath all of it: war. Long before anyone could write the word nation, human groups were already killing each other over land. Sites across Africa preserve the evidence in bone: arrowheads lodged in ribs, skulls caved in, mass graves holding entire wiped-out communities. This wasn't the invention of countries. This was the reason countries became necessary. When a valley, a river, or a hunting ground ran short, conflict followed almost automatically. Some communities vanished completely. Others swallowed their defeated neighbors whole. Anthropologist Robert Carnero noticed something chilling about where this happened fastest. Places boxed in by desert, mountains, or ocean. Places where the losers had nowhere left to run. No escape route. No fresh valley over the next hill. Just absorption. Village into chiefdom, chiefdom into state. Countries, in other words, weren't only born from people choosing to cooperate. They were also born from people who had nowhere left to flee. Egypt shows this with almost eerie clarity. Two separate political worlds, Upper and Lower Egypt, existed side by side for centuries. Then, suddenly, one ruler, one crown, one state where there had been two. Elsewhere, the pattern varied wildly. Some kingdoms grew through conquest, some through trade, some through marriage alliances that look almost accidental in hindsight. There was never one blueprint, except maybe there was a second blueprint, one that looked nothing like a king at all. Look at the Indus Valley, and the story breaks in half. Cities spread across an area the size of a modern country. Streets cut in careful grids, bricks manufactured to matching dimensions across hundreds of kilometers, weights and measures standardized like a single company ran the whole operation, and yet, after a century of digging, no palace, no monument to a glorified king, no throne room. If power wasn't concentrated in one ruler, where was it? Many archaeologists now suspect the answer is almost anticlimactic. Shared standards, shared commerce, cooperation without a crown, which means the entire premise of how countries form was wrong from the start. There isn't one path. Some states are built by a king's ambition. Others are built by a merchant's spreadsheet, different roads, same destination. It's worth pausing here for a moment. By this point in the story, none of this was inevitable. In one valley, a family's decision not to leave hardened slowly into ownership. In another, a stone monument gave strangers a reason to trust each other. In a third, war left the losers nowhere to go, so they simply became part of the winners. Layer by layer, without any single plan behind it, these small, separate choices were quietly assembling into something the people living through them had no name for yet. That patience is worth remembering, because the next shift happened faster, and it changed what belonging even meant. Something quieter was also happening, and it mattered more than any war. For nearly all of human history, the answer to "Who are you?" was, "My father's son, my clan's daughter, my tribe's child." States began asking a different question entirely. Not "Who are your ancestors?" "Where do you live?" That sounds like a small edit. It rewired the human brain. Loyalty, for the first time, could stretch to cover people you would never meet, never share blood with, never even see in your lifetime, simply because a line on a map happened to include you both. That idea was still incomplete, though. A kingdom could now tax you, conscript you, judge you, but it still hadn't convinced you it was yours. One ingredient was missing before these territories could feel like the countries we know today. Not blood, not soil, a story everyone agreed to believe at the same time. Think about your own country for a second. You've met almost none of the people who live in it. You don't know their names, their streets, their faces. You'd probably disagree with plenty of them about nearly everything, and yet, somehow, they're still your people. That feeling isn't natural. It was manufactured. For most of history, loyalty belonged to a king, not a country. Change the king, and your allegiance changed overnight, no different from changing employers. The modern nation demanded something far stranger. Convince millions of people, who will never meet, that they are, somehow, one community. Political scientist Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities. Not imagined because they're false. Imagined because every single citizen is carrying the exact same picture in their head of a group they've never actually seen. A farmer in one province and a merchant 400 miles away, total strangers, both quietly certain they belong to the same we. That shared imagined reality is one of the most powerful things humans have ever built. So how do you get millions of separate people to carry the same picture in their heads? You print it. Before books were common, most people's whole identity stopped at the edge of their village. News crawled. Dialects shifted every few miles. Sometimes the next town over was barely intelligible. Then the printing press arrived, and something changed that nobody had planned for. The same words, the same language, the same news, appearing in hundreds of towns simultaneously. People who would never meet were suddenly reading identical sentences on the same morning. Without a single conversation between them, they began imagining themselves as members of one enormous, invisible club. Shared language became shared identity. Shared identity became the raw material of the nation. Then schools finished the job printing started. Governments built national education systems. And suddenly every child in the territory learned the same history, the same heroes, the same map, the same flag. Generation after generation absorbed the same imagined community before they were even old enough to question it. Flags, anthems, public holidays. None of it was random. Each one was a small, repeated injection of the same message. You belong to something enormous that you will never fully see. Industrialization then did something schools alone couldn't. Factories and railways crammed together enormous populations who shared no family ties whatsoever. To keep the machine running, governments needed one language, one currency, one legal system. Historian Ernest Gellner flipped the standard explanation on its head. Nationalism didn't emerge because nations already existed. Nationalism built the nations. In case after case, the nation wasn't discovered waiting underground like a fossil. It was manufactured, on purpose, like a product. Italy proves it almost embarrassingly well. When Italy unified in the 19th century, most Italians didn't speak Italian. They spoke dozens of mutually confusing regional dialects. Uniting the map took a treaty. Uniting the people took decades. Schools, newspapers, military service, relentless repetition. Before Italian felt like something you were, rather than something a politician had declared you to be. The country came first. The feeling of belonging to it came later, manufactured on purpose. Meanwhile, in France, an even bigger idea was detonating. For centuries, kings claimed their power came straight from God. Ordinary people existed to serve the crown. Full stop, no negotiation. The French Revolution tore that logic out by the root. Sovereignty, revolutionaries argued, didn't belong to a monarch, it belonged to the nation itself. Subjects became citizens overnight. But that New Deal came with new fine print. If the nation now belonged to you, you could also be asked to die for it. Military duty stopped being a debt owed to a king's ego. It became a debt owed to an idea, a story you'd never questioned, about people you'd never met. For the first time, millions of strangers were willing to die for each other, on the strength of a shared imagination alone. That emotional bond made countries stronger than any kingdom that came before them. But not every line on today's map was born this way. Many were drawn by people who had never once set foot in the land they were dividing. During the colonial era, European powers carved up Africa and the Middle East in meeting rooms thousands of kilometers away, often ignoring the languages, cultures, and communities already living there. When those colonies won independence, most kept the borders anyway, because redrawing them risked something worse. Endless war over where the correct line should be, so the map you were born into is far younger than it looks. Some of the ancient nations on your screen right now are, politically, barely older than your grandparents. And it's still not finished. Today, nearly 200 countries carve up the planet. It feels permanent, inevitable, like it's always been this way. It hasn't. For more than 95% of human history, none of this existed. No flags, no passports, no border guards, no line that could turn a familiar hillside into foreign soil. Countries are not ancient. They are one of the newest things about us. So how did we actually get here? Not in one leap. In layers, each one quietly built on top of the last. First, people stopped wandering. Land turned from a resource into a home, then from a home into an identity, sealed by the graves of the people who'd lived there. Then came surplus grain, and the moment something could be counted, someone learned it could also be taken. Taxation, government, invented almost by accident. Then walls, Coordination on a scale family ties alone could never produce. Then writing, not for poetry, for debt, which finally let a ruler govern more people than any human memory could hold. Then war, and the brutal sorting that followed it, villages into chiefdoms, chiefdoms into kingdoms, especially in places where the losers had nowhere left to flee. And finally, the hardest layer of all, the one that took the longest to build. Belief. Millions of strangers convinced, through print, through school books, through flags and anthems and shared stories, that they belong to each other. A kingdom rules people. A country convinces them they were always one people to begin with. None of it was inevitable. Wars redrew it. Empires collapsed and reshuffled it. Diplomats in distant rooms signed it into existence with a pen. Revolutions tore it up and started again. Many of today's borders are younger than your grandparents. The map has never been finished. It never will be. Here's the part worth sitting with. Countries don't exist because a river or a mountain demanded them. They exist because enough people, at the same time, agreed to believe in the same invisible line. Money works the same way. Paper that has value only because everyone agrees it does. Law works the same way. Countries are simply the largest version of that same agreement humanity has ever reached. That doesn't make them fake. Their consequences are as real as it gets. Where you're allowed to live, which rights protect you, whether you wake up in peace or in war. But strip away the flag, the anthem, the passport stamp, and what's actually left is this: not a mountain, not a river, not the soil under your feet, but a story, renewed, generation after generation, by millions of people who will never meet. So the next time you cross a border, remember what's actually happening. You're not crossing a river, you're not crossing a mountain. You're crossing one of the oldest shared stories our species has ever told itself. We began this story the same way. Every country on Earth is imaginary, not because it isn't real, but because millions of strangers wake up every morning, all over the planet, and quietly choose to keep imagining it together.